Hello, my name is Nathan Brummel, and I am the professor of Systematic Theology and New Testament at Divine Hope Reformed Bible Seminary. And I'm also the father of Peter here and Abriel. Peter, my son, is 14 years old and he is in the 8th grade. And Abriel is 8 years old and she is in the 3rd grade. What we want to do is have a time of teaching of the Heidelberg Catechism so that children who are homeschooled perhaps can watch these videos and they can learn about the history and the context and the teachings found in this beautiful and well-loved catechism. But first of all, we have to ask, well, what is the Heidelberg Catechism and what is a catechism? Peter, do you have any idea what a catechism is?
A catechism is a compilation of beliefs.
Well, it's true that in a catechism there is a list and there's a whole bunch of beliefs and they're in an orderly way, but that's not really what a catechism is per se. So what is a catechism? Well, it's a teaching tool for children. A catechism is used to teach children by asking questions and then answering questions. So that the entire Heidelberg Catechism is composed of questions and answers, and it's like the teacher is asking the question, and then you, the catechumen, the student, has the answer. And this is the way in which Christians have discipled new converts and children for centuries and centuries and centuries. So we're not doing anything new. Now, those of you who grew up in Reformed churches, you will know what the Heidelberg Catechism is. The Heidelberg Catechism is a catechism that was written, no surprise, in the city of Heidelberg in Germany. Now, before we begin to talk about the basic teachings found in the Heidelberg Catechism, we want to introduce you to this catechism and what's all involved in it, and we want to tell you something about its history. Well, the first thing we need to say is that this catechism is not doing anything novel. Guess what we study in the Heidelberg Catechism? 3 great documents. The Apostles' Creed. What's the Apostles' Creed, Abriel?
I don't know.
You don't know what it is? You've memorized it though, haven't you? So it's a creed that in which we confess the doctrines of the apostles. Now, did the apostles like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John write the Apostles' Creed? No. Early Christians, though, put this creed together, and it's based on the teaching of the apostles. Now, the other day I heard you saying the Apostles' Creed out loud to your mom, Abriel. And I remember that your mom even asked you a question. She said, what does it mean, I believe a holy Catholic church? And you said you didn't know what that meant. But then your mom told you. What does that mean?
I know what it is.
What?
It means universal.
It means universal, that's right.
Catholic means.
Catholic means universal. I believe in a universal church. That's right, the Church of Jesus Christ that's found around the world. So in the Heidelberg Catechism, guess what we're going to do? We're going to look at the Apostles' Creed. And we'll go through each little statement, each little phrase, each little article in the Apostles' Creed. Now that's nothing new. Guess what? If you would have been a Christian converted in the year 300, so that's 1,700 years ago for those of you who can do your math, and you became a confessing Christian before you were baptized, probably on Easter Sunday, where you dress up in a white robe and you would get baptized publicly, guess what you would do? For about 60 days, your bishop or your priest would sit down with you and he'd teach you the doctrines of the Christian faith. He would prepare you for your baptism and public profession of faith. And guess what he would use? You guessed it, the Apostles' Creed. So what we're doing is nothing new. 1,700 years ago, new Christians were being taught the basic, fundamental, important doctrines of the Christian faith using the Apostles' Creed, and that's what we're studying together. But guess what? Your bishop back in those days wouldn't stop with teaching you the Apostles' Creed. Guess what else he would use? The 10 Commandments. Are they found in the Bible? Where?
Exodus 20.
Exodus 20, and also in Deuteronomy 5. So notice your minister or bishop would teach you the doctrines of the Christian faith and how we ought to live using the 10 Commandments. Well, guess what we study in the Heidelberg Catechism? The 10 Commandments. And we'll go through each one of them in order. There will be one Lord's Day dealing with each one of the 10 Commandments.
How many Lord's Days are there?
Well, she asked how many Lord's Days are there? Well, how many weeks are there in a year? Do you guys know?
Yeah.
How many?
52.
52, yes. So there are 52 Lord's Days, actually. One for each week of the year. That's how the Heidelberg Catechism is divided into 52 parts. It also has many questions and answers. Now, the first question and answers and Lord's Days go through the Apostles' Creed, and then they go through the Ten Commandments, and then finally they look at one last little document we find in the Bible, which is the Lord's Prayer. What's the Lord's Prayer?
It's a prayer that Jesus taught the disciples.
That's right. So did Jesus come up with this prayer? Yes, he did he? Yeah, the apostles didn't come up with the Apostles' Creed, but Jesus did come up with the Lord's Prayer. And so in this class, look what we're going to study. We're going to study the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Those are what you would have been taught if you were a Christian in the early church, like Augustine, for example. About 1600 and more years ago, when Augustine of Hippo was converted and became a Christian, he would have met with Bishop Ambrose. And Bishop Ambrose, in preparing him for his public confession of faith, would have taught him the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Although sometimes, actually, they waited till after you had made your confession of faith. And then they said, well, now that you're a Christian and you're in the in-group, now we'll teach you the Lord's Prayer. And we're going to hold off on teaching you that until you are a confessing Christian. But we don't do that. We realize that, no, Christians should be taught about prayer. And children, covenant children, should be taught about prayer. Now, the Heidelberg Catechism then involves a study of the basic doctrines of the Christian faith. Notice, we're not just studying anything or whatever we might want to study. We're going to be studying the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Can you say those after me, April? What are we going to be studying in this class? Oh, you were listening real good.
The Ten Commandments and the Lord's Prayer.
That's right. So we're going to be studying the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Can you tell me that?
The Apostles' Creed, the Lord's Prayer, and
One more. The Ten
Commandments.
That's right. All
I
right.
said that already.
Well, we can watch the video and we'll find out you did it. But anyhow, this is fine. It's okay if we don't know the answers. Then we can poke fun of each other. And if I don't know the answer, we can have a little fun with each other too.
How many Lord's Days were there again?
52, because there's 52 weeks in here. Now, what the deal is that after the Heidelberg Catechism was prepared, it was divided into 52 parts so that a teacher or a minister could take the children through it in 1 year. So that's why they divided it to 52 different parts. Now, hopefully you can, if you're at home, you can get your own copy of the Heidelberg Catechism. You can find them for free online. You can just look one up online. You can find one free and you can just print it out, or you can get other little booklets. We have a little booklet here called Christian Truths Summarized, the Creeds and Reformed Confessions. And it happens to have a copy of the three forms of unity, which are the three confessions in the Reformed churches. And the Heidelberg Catechism is one of them. So now I've begun to tell you a little bit about what we're going to study in the Heidelberg Catechism. Now let's begin to talk about its history. Long, long time ago, before you were born or your great-great-grandparents were born, back in the olden days, back in the 1500s actually.
Before Daddy was born.
Hey, I'm not that old. So in the 1560s, you're right. In the 1560s, the Heidelberg Catechism was published. It actually was published in the year 1563. And if I was going to give you a test, you would have to know that in 1563 it was published. Now in 1563, what was going on? Was the United States or was America yet discovered?
Yes.
Yes, when was it discovered actually?
1492.
Columbus.
Well, not America.
Sailed the oceans blue. You're
not
right. So in
really.
1492.
It was small islands off the coast of America, not the actual mainland.
Okay, what about Leif Erikson and the Vikings who supposedly came earlier? Okay, so this is following the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus and others. And it's also following the beginning of the Great Protestant Reformation, when God began to reform his church. What year did the Great Protestant Reformation
1517.
begin? That's right, 1517. And what date and what month?
It was October 31.
October 31, that's right. And why do you say that date?
Because that was the date that Martin Luther pinned the
95
5 Theses to the church door.
In
I know you're going to
Wittenberg,
say
Germany,
something
that's right.
different.
Good, okay, so that's right. So now think about it. So if it's in 1517 that the Reformation begins, and now we're talking 1563, it's not too far later.
Oh,
Now, Martin Luther has died by this time. John Calvin's still alive, though. He has just a short time to live yet. So that's the time period in which we're talking. Now, for those of you at home who haven't studied much about the Great Protestant Reformation, there are some good books you can read about it or find about it. Maybe you can talk to your parents and see if they would get you a good church history book or something that would talk about Luther's Reformation and then how God reformed the church throughout Europe. Now, we don't have a lot of time to talk about that, but our story of the Heidelberg Catechism, you see, takes place in the context of the Reformation. So the Reformation has come to Europe. God is beginning to reform his church. Now, what are some of the great doctrines of the Christian faith that the reformers like Martin Luther and Calvin affirmed?
Justification by faith alone.
That's right. So Luther discovered that the Bible teaches that we are justified by grace alone, through faith alone in Jesus Christ, on the basis of Jesus' atoning work alone, right? Also, the Reformation said that the Holy Scriptures are the final authority for faith and life. So those are some of the fundamental doctrines of the Reformation. Now, what is happening in Europe is that many of the people in Germany, Abriel, had joined the Reformation. They became evangelical Christians. They became Christians. Now, they were Lutherans because they followed Luther's view of the Lord's Supper. And so I want you to think about where these different Protestants were located, because you should think about Europe having basically two large Protestant groups. I mean, the south of Europe, in Italy and Spain, remained strongly Roman Catholic, and they bitterly persecuted Christians. But in the northern part of Europe, guess what? Many people were saved and joined the Protestant Reformation. Now, in the northern part of Europe, in Germany and in Denmark and in the Scandinavian countries, which include Norway and Sweden and Finland, for example, in those areas, people became Lutheran. So we could say they were Lutheran Protestants. Now, I wish we had a map that I could show you.
What was that?
Yeah, it's Norway and Sweden. And mainly Germany were part of the Lutheran Protestant Reformation.
What was it?
Germany
Sweden.
and Sweden.
Norway.
Now, maybe one of these days we'll have to get a map, and we can use a map to show the children at home about this too. So Germany was filled with Lutherans, and the Scandinavian countries had many Lutheran Protestants. Now, our tradition, though, is not from the Lutheran tradition, it's from the Reformed tradition. And so
Why don't
our
we do that?
story...
Lutheran tradition.
Why do I talk about them then? Because Heidelberg, where the Heidelberg Catechism is written, is in Germany, where most of the people are Lutheran, so that will be controversial.
She's asking why we aren't Lutheran.
Oh, because we do not believe in the Lutheran doctrine of the Lord's Supper.
What do they believe in?
They believe in something called consubstantiation.
That
Where they
looks
say
like a
that-
confusing word.
Well, they say that at the Lord's Supper, when you partake of the bread, that the literal flesh and the literal blood of Jesus is in, with, and by the bread, so that when you chew it, you're literally eating Jesus' actual physical flesh.
Who
And
has
so,
eat people?
well, that was the Lutheran view, and the Lutherans were actually quite mean to the Reformed, because the Reformed believed that, no, it was by faith we partake of Christ, who is present spiritually. He's truly present by his Spirit, and we partake of him even though physically and bodily he's at the right hand of God in heaven. But anyhow, that caused Luther to be mean to Ulrich Zwingli and to some of the Reformed. And later Lutherans, who were very hardcore polemical people who would attack people a lot, were very polemical in attacking the Reformed because they didn't believe in that. Now, what interests us is the Reformed tradition, because the Heidelberg Catechism is a Reformed catechism. Now, you need to know that not only was Lutheranism in lots of parts of Europe, but also Reformed Protestantism was in really more places in Europe. So that, for example, the Reformed churches began in Switzerland. So Switzerland became Reformed due to the influence of Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin and others, whether Theodore Beza or Henry Bullinger. But then also the Reformed faith spread to France. Also the Reformed faith spread into southern Germany, and that's where we're going to find the Reformed faith in the Palatinate in Germany, where the Heidelberg Catechism is written. Also the Reformed faith was spread in places like Poland and in Hungary and Transylvania to the east, and also in the Low Countries, where Dutch Reformed. And our ancestors were part of Reformed Protestantism. And then over across the English Channel in England, the Church of England became part of Reformed Protestantism, not Lutheranism. And then in Scotland, they became Presbyterians, who are the brothers of the Reformed, and therefore they're part of Reformed Protestantism, as was the case in Northern Ireland. So the larger picture is that we have a lot of people in Europe who are becoming Protestants. Some are Lutheran Protestants, and others are Reformed Protestants like we are. Now, in the southern part of Germany, a new elector came to the throne when he was in his early 40s, and his name was Elector Frederick III. Wouldn't you like it if you get to put a second or a third or fourth after your name? Makes you sound kind of important, doesn't it? Well, this man was from a dynasty, and in Germany at the time, they did not have one united country. Today, Germany is one country. Under communism, for many, many decades, that wasn't the case. There was East Germany, which was communist, and then West Germany, which was democratic and capitalistic. Now, however, after the fall of the Iron Curtain, we have one Germany. But back in the days we're talking about, Germany was not one unified country. It was divided into all these separate territories where you'd have a prince. Some of their territories were bigger, some of them were small.
Like the feudal.
Yeah, it's like a feudal thing going on, yeah. And so there would be constant fighting. And now what happened is that a good number of those princes became Lutherans. Some still remained Roman Catholic. But there were hardly any who were Reformed. Now, Elector Frederick III became Reformed. And so now he's a prince, and he's a very godly prince, and he cares about people like you. He cares about little people. He cares about children in his country, in his Palatinate. And he knows that children and their dads and moms, they have come out of Roman Catholicism, and they don't know their Bible well, and they don't know doctrine, and they don't know theology. And so he wants a teaching tool for them. So guess what he wants written?
He wants Caspar Olevianus and
Zacharias
Ursinus to write the Heidelberg Catechism.
That's right. So the purpose of writing the catechism is to teach children and even adults as well the basic doctrines of the Christian faith.
Why did I say children? Oh.
Because especially the children, of course, needed to be taught in the schools. And they had new Christian schools started up, and so it was a place where they could be taught the basic doctrines of the Christian faith. Now, Elector Frederick III was a godly man, and he was very spiritually minded, but he was a man who had experienced great sorrow in his life. You shouldn't think, wow, he was a prince, he's powerful, he's rich, he has a castle. He had a castle. He had a fancy church where he could worship, and where Caspar Olevianus is made the preacher, the court preacher. He also is the prince in an area where they have a prestigious university, the University of Heidelberg, which was famous and had an amazing, amazing library. But he was a man...
The library so amazing.
Well, because books were terribly expensive back in those days, remember? Because
it
up until that time,
library?
remember, everybody had had to copy their books. Now, of course, books were being published since the invention of the printing press by Mr. Gutenberg. And the Protestants were publishing a lot of stuff, but books were still expensive back in those days.
But now they're really cheap.
Well, now they're cheap in comparison, although right now I've tried to buy some books recently from some publishers in Europe, and guess what? One book costs $140.
Some of them can get pretty expensive.
Some of them can get expensive, some can be cheap today. But yeah, they were very expensive back in those days. Now, Elector Frederick III, he's called an elector. Why do you think he was called an elector? Who was he electing?
Was he elected by the people? Or no?
No, princes in those days weren't elected. No, they pretty much, as their daddy was the prince or the king, and that's how they got to be the king. Unless they'd conquer it by the sword, edge of the sword. Well, the answer is that he was one of the electors of the Holy Roman Empire, which wasn't holy and wasn't Roman and wasn't even an empire. But you see, in Germany, there were 7 princes or rulers. Some of them would even be Roman Catholic archbishops who were big territorial rulers. There were 7 electors, and they could elect who the emperor was, who was to be the emperor over Germany. And at this time, guess who the emperor was? Charles V, who was a Spanish monarch. So the Spanish monarch who is sending all of his soldiers and stuff to the New World to conquer South America and Central America and plunder lots of gold and stuff like that. Charles V is the emperor, and he hates Protestantism. He's a devoted Roman Catholic. But anyhow, he had a very influential position because he was even the chairman of the group of 7 men who would elect who would be the emperor. And that person happened to be the Spanish king at this time. So that's a pretty influential position. So he's a pretty powerful prince. Now, what happens is that he decides that he needs a teaching tool. Now, the story...
But why was he so sad?
Oh, yes. Why was he sad? He had a rough life, I said. Well, he had a son, you see. A son who is... 2 sons, actually, that went and studied in France. Probably because there was a place where they could study with Reformed people in France. And so he had 2 sons who went to France. And while one of the sons was there, he was with a friend. And that friend and he came to a river to cross. Perhaps they were heading back home again or something. And they got in a boat. And guess who else got in the boat? Some drunks. In the middle of the river, the drunks knocked the boat over. And Elector Frederick III's son fell in the water and drowned. The other young man, who was the friend of him, was in the water, tried to save him, and didn't succeed. And so guess it was who had to go to Elector Frederick III and tell him the news that his precious son had died.
His other son.
It was Caspar Olevianus. Caspar Olevianus, who became one of the authors of the Heidelberg Catechism, was that young man. So notice Caspar Olevianus had a rough thing happen in his life in his early 20s already. He had lost a good friend of his and saw him drown before his very eyes. So Elector Frederick was a man who needed comfort too.
That river must have been pretty deep.
Yeah, maybe it was flowing faster than normal. And Elector Frederick later on would almost lose his throne because of the fact that he had supported the publication of the Heidelberg Catechism, and we'll talk about that and how he had appeared before a diet, where the Roman Catholics wanted to depose him from his princehood. So this young man named Caspar Olevianus became one of the authors of the Heidelberg Catechism. There were 2 authors of the Heidelberg Catechism. One is Caspar Olevianus. The other is a young man named Zacharius Ursinus. And your children at home, when you think about 2 people who wrote this catechism, maybe you have a copy of it with you now, you shouldn't think that the men who wrote this were like old men with long beards or something like that. No, they were young kids who were in their 20s. And so these are young men. Yeah, maybe they did have some beards by this time, but that was the custom of the day. But these were by no means some old theologians sitting up in ivory towers. These were young men who had experienced a lot of trials in life. Let's talk about Caspar Olevianus and the trials he went through. So what happened is that Caspar Olevianus, he studied and became a minister. He went back to France, which was his home country, where the Reformed faith was making a lot of progress, but a lot of ministers who went there to preach were persecuted too. That's why when Frenchmen were educated in Geneva, Switzerland, by Calvin and Theodore Beza, and then they went back home Many of them would be caught and thrown in prison or put to death. So Caspar Olevianus goes back home to France, and he starts preaching the gospel in his village. And many of the people in the village heard the gospel with gladness. But the local governor got mad. He hated the doctrines of the Bible. He was a strong Roman Catholic, and so what he did is he had the crops of these farmers burned. Now think about that. Back in those days, when you get your food and you make your money from raising crops, what happens if you burn people's crops?
You don't get the money and you don't get the food.
That's right. And on top of that, he had young Caspar Olevianus imprisoned. He had him arrested and he threw him in a dungeon.
I can remember Samson tied a bunch of foxes together and
That's right.
ran around in the field.
And he burned up the Philistines' fields. Yeah, so that governor did that to these evangelical Reformed Christians.
Except without the foxes.
Yeah, he didn't use foxes. Now, there sits Caspar Olevianus in prison, and when you think of prison, you shouldn't think of like the prisons where I teach, where guys always have food, and there's some health care, and there's rules about how clean they have to keep things, and there's certain levels of security. I mean, this was a dungeon. This was a place where they give you wretched food, where you can imagine at night there's mice running around. You've got lice biting on you, no doubt. So you're itching all night long. Mosquitoes can no doubt come inside if you got mosquitoes around. And a wretched, wretched place to be. And that's where he was incarcerated. But guess who heard about it? Yes, Elector Frederick III heard about that. And so he used his diplomatic channels to make contact with the rulers and leaders in France to try to get him released. And they did. I'm sure that governor was not happy to release Caspar Olevianus, but he did. And then Elector Frederick III invited Caspar to come to Heidelberg and be the preacher in Heidelberg, in the court
Heidelberg
church.
almost sounds like Heidelberg Catechism.
That's right. She says Heidelberg sounds like the Heidelberg Catechism. And the reason it's called that is because it was written in the city of Heidelberg, which was where the castle of Elector Frederick III was, and where Zacharias Ursinus was the professor of theology, and Caspar Olevianus was the preacher. So when the prince would go to church, he would hear Caspar Olevianus delivering the sermon. See. Now there's one more person you haven't met yet.
So the town was named after him?
No, the town was named Heidelberg. That was an old city prior to that time. Now we haven't talked about Zacharias Ursinus, who is the third person who plays a role in the story. He is someone...
Wasn't he a theology professor?
Yes, he was. And he was trained under Melanchthon in Wittenberg. He had grown up apparently in Lutheran circles. But what happened is that when he was studying under Melanchthon and then later under others, he moved away from the Lutheran view of the Lord's Supper. He didn't believe in consubstantiation, or in the doctrine of ubiquity that we'll talk about later. And so what happens is that he had to flee, actually. He had to flee from Germany because they were going to persecute him because he wasn't Lutheran. And what happened is that he went to Zurich, and people in Zurich recommended him to Elector Frederick III, and so Elector Frederick III needed to have professors of theology.
They freed from what?
He had to flee from Germany and from Wittenberg. Oh, he's still a young guy. He's only 28 years old when he writes the Heidelberg Catechism, along with Zacharias Ursinus, or Olevianus. Olevianus is only 26. He had to flee from Wittenberg, or Wittenberg. It starts with a W. And that was where Luther had taught at the University of Wittenberg, and that's where Melanchthon still taught at this time. So anyhow, that's how everybody comes together. So they are now in the city of Heidelberg. We have Elector Frederick III, and we have a young preacher, and we have a young theologian, and Elector Frederick III asks them to put together a catechism to instruct the children in the Palatinate in Germany. And that's the document that we're going to use to learn about the Apostles' Creed, the Ten Commandments, and the Lord's Prayer. Next time we'll begin to talk about the major theme that runs through the Heidelberg Catechism, which is the theme of comfort. So we'll see you back then.